You're going to die on a completely random day, and right now you have absolutely no idea when that is. And here's what no one talks about. The moment most people truly absorb that fact, not just intellectually, but feel it in their chest, it doesn't destroy them, it changes them. Sometimes in ways that look a lot like what you'd call waking up. So the real question isn't why does life end? It's why does knowing it end make some people crumble? And make others suddenly start actually living? The answer starts with something that psychology has known for decades but almost nobody uses in real life, and we're going to unpack every layer of it today. By the time this video ends, you're going to understand why your brain is literally wired to avoid thinking about death, why that avoidance is secretly running your biggest decisions, and how the people who have come closest to dying consistently describe it as the moment everything finally made sense. This isn't philosophy, this is science, and it applies to you right now, wherever you are in life. Let's start with something that sounds almost too obvious to say, but almost no one ever actually says it. You woke up today. You have no idea what you're doing with your life, or maybe you have a very clear plan and you're executing it step by step. Either way, at some point, on a Tuesday or a Sunday or a perfectly ordinary afternoon, you won't wake up anymore. Not because something went wrong, not as a punishment, just because that's the shape of being alive. And here's what's strange about that. Most of us go through entire years, and sometimes entire decades, without ever letting that land. We know it the way we know there's a sun. We've heard the fact. We've said life is short at a party or in a toast. We've nodded at funerals. But do we feel it? Do we let ourselves sit with the actual full-weight reality that the thing we call our life, this entire network of relationships, ambitions, memories, fears, plans, inside jokes, morning routines, things we still want to say to people, is temporary? Psychologists have a name for the mechanism that prevents us from doing that. It's called terror management theory, and it is one of the most quietly powerful forces shaping your behavior right now, even as you watch this video. Terror management theory, or TMT, was first developed in the 1980s by researchers Jeff Greenberg, Sheldon Solomon, and Tom Pischinsky, building on the work of cultural anthropologist Ernest Becker, who won a Pulitzer Prize for his 1973 book, The Denial of Death. Becker's central argument was breathtaking in its simplicity. Humans are the only animals who know they will die, and that knowledge is so overwhelming that virtually the entire structure of human culture, religion, legacy, fame, money, status, art, exists, at least in part, as a psychological buffer against that terror. Let that sink in for a moment. The reason you care so much about what people think of you, the reason you want to build something that lasts, the reason fame seems so appealing even to people who say they don't want it. Maybe, at least partly, because your brain is running a background program trying to convince you that you matter enough to survive. Not survive literally, but survive symbolically, in memory, in impact, in legacy. Your mind is trying to solve the unsolvable equation. How do I feel like I won't be forgotten when I know, somewhere underneath all of this, that I will be? And here's the first thing that should stop you cold. If you don't know this process is happening, it runs your life without your permission. In 1989, psychologists ran one of the first formal experiments to test terror management theory. They asked a group of municipal court judges to set bail amounts for a hypothetical case of a woman accused of prostitution. Before doing so, half the judges were asked to write briefly about their own death, what would happen to them physically, and what emotions arose when they thought about dying. The other half wrote about something neutral, watching TV. For example, here's what happened. The judges who had not thought about death set an average bail of about $50. The judges who had been reminded of their own mortality set an average bail of $455. 9 times higher, same case, same evidence, same people. The only difference was that one group had briefly touched the awareness of their own death, and then, without realizing it, their brain overcorrected by clinging harder to cultural values. Moral frameworks, rules, and social order. The reminder of mortality made them more punitive, more rigid, more desperate to defend the worldview that gave their existence meaning. This experiment has been replicated hundreds of times in different forms. When people are reminded of death, even subliminally, even by walking past a funeral home or sitting near a cemetery, they become measurably more nationalistic, more judgmental toward people who are different from them, more generous toward people who share their values, and more hostile toward people who challenge them. In other words, a quiet, unconscious fear of death is quietly, unconsciously shaping your politics, your relationships, your generosity, your prejudices, right now, today. And here's the twist that should make this feel personal. You don't have to be sitting next to a coffin for this to activate. Researchers have found that even subtle environmental cues, A word, an image, a smell can trigger what they call mortality salience, which is just a scientific way of saying your brain just got a flash of its own finitude. And when that happens, your brain's first instinct is not to reflect deeply on what matters, it's to run, to distract, to cling harder to whatever story makes you feel like you're part of something bigger and more permanent than yourself. So here's the question we need to hold for a moment before we go further. If your brain naturally runs away from thinking about death, what are you missing by letting it? Let's set the death question to the side for just a second. Because before we can talk about mortality, we have to talk about the thing that makes mortality feel so heavy. We have to talk about suffering, because here's the setup that most people find themselves in. Life is hard. Really hard. In ways that no one warned you about specifically, even if everyone warned you in general. You work, you try, you sacrifice, you get disappointed, you recover, you try again. You carry things that are heavy and sometimes invisible. You show up on days when showing up costs you something real. And then, underneath all of that effort, there's this awareness, sometimes loud and sometimes a whisper, that one day it ends. That all of this striving and hurting and loving and building stops. And for a lot of people, that combination, the effort plus the finitude, produces a very specific kind of despair. Not depression exactly, more like a quiet vertigo. A sense of, what's the point? Psychologists call this existential anxiety. And it's different from ordinary anxiety about specific problems. Existential anxiety is anxiety about the nature of existence itself. About the fact that you are here, you didn't choose to be here, and you will eventually not be here, and there's no instruction manual for what to do with the time in between. Viktor Frankl, the Austrian psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor who developed logotherapy, one of the most important schools of existential psychology, argued that existential anxiety is not a pathology. It's not a disorder to be fixed. It's a signal that you are human enough, conscious enough, to be confronting the real questions. In his book Man's Search for Meaning, written after surviving Auschwitz, Dachau, and 2 other Nazi concentration camps, Frankl describes something that should permanently reframe how you think about suffering. He observed that the prisoners who survived, physically and psychologically, were not always the strongest, the youngest, or even the healthiest. They were the ones who had found a reason to survive, something they believed they still needed to do, or say, or see, or become. The people who collapsed first, Frankl noticed, were often those who had lost not their health, but their sense of meaning. He wrote, "Those who have a why to live can bear almost any how." Now here's what makes this relevant to you, and not just to people in extreme situations. Research consistently shows that the experience of meaning is not reserved for dramatic moments, it's built in the ordinary ones. In fact, a 2016 study published in the Journal of Positive Psychology found that people who reported high levels of meaning in their lives tended to describe it in terms of 3 specific things: coherence, life makes sense to me; purpose, I have direction and goals; and mattering, I am significant to others and to something larger than myself. And here's what's striking. Those 3 things don't require wealth, they don't require perfect health, they don't require any particular relationship status or career level or level of achievement. They are psychological orientations, ways of relating to your own experience, which means the suffering is not the enemy of meaning. In many cases, the research shows it's the source of it. There is a category of human experience that sits at the exact intersection of everything we've been talking about, and the data from it is extraordinary. Near-death experiences, or NDEs, have been documented in medical literature for decades, and while the debate about their metaphysical significance continues, and is interesting, what's less debated and far more psychologically relevant is what happens to people after they have them. Dr. Pim van Lommel, a Dutch cardiologist, published one of the most rigorous studies of near-death experiences in The Lancet in 2001. He followed 344 cardiac arrest survivors over 8 years, patients who had been clinically dead, no heartbeat, no brain activity, for periods ranging from a few seconds to several minutes. About 18% reported a classic NDE, a sensation of leaving the body, moving through a tunnel, encountering light, reviewing their life, and feeling profound peace. What happened to those people afterward? They were measurably different, not in small ways, in large, life-altering ways. Compared to cardiac arrest survivors who did not report an NDE, the NDE group showed, at the 8-year follow-up, significantly less fear of death, significantly greater sense of meaning in life, significantly increased empathy and compassion, significantly less interest in material possessions and social status, significantly greater interest in connecting with others, and significantly greater engagement with spiritual or existential questions, regardless of their prior religious beliefs. And the pattern Van Lommel found has been replicated across multiple cultures, multiple studies, multiple medical contexts. Whether the person was religious or atheist, young or old, the post-NDE profile looks remarkably similar. But here's what's most important for our conversation. Almost universally, people who have NDEs report that in the moment of confronting their own death, really confronting it, not abstractly but immediately and inescapably, what filled their mind was not regret about what they hadn't achieved, it was regret about how they had been present, no, hadn't been, in their relationships, and they didn't think, I wish I'd gotten that promotion. They thought, I wish I'd called my friend. I wish I'd forgiven sooner. I wish I'd been less afraid to say what I actually felt. And this pattern is so consistent across NDE literature that researcher Kenneth Ring, who has studied NDE since the 1980s and written extensively on the subject, calls it the core insight of the near-death experience, that love and connection are what matter and almost everything else is noise. Now, you don't need to nearly die to absorb that lesson. But the research suggests that most of us, unless something shakes us loose, won't absorb it. Because our brains, as we said, are built to avoid exactly this kind of confrontation. So the question is, what does it take, short of a cardiac event, to genuinely shift how you relate to your own mortality? We're going to get there. But first, we need to go a little deeper into why the struggle itself feels so personal. Here's something that almost no one says, but almost everyone feels. There is a version of life you imagined when you were younger. Or maybe not even consciously imagined, but assumed. And then life turned out to not be that. Things took longer than you thought they would. Some things you worked for didn't come. Some things you didn't ask for did. The relationships that were supposed to be easy turned out to be complicated. The body that was supposed to be reliable started to send notices. The certainty you thought would come with time, the sense of knowing exactly who you are and where you belong, maybe still hasn't fully arrived. And in the gap between what you imagined and what actually happened, there's often something that feels a lot like failure, even when, by any reasonable measure, you haven't failed at all. Psychologists call this the expectation-reality gap, and it's one of the most reliable predictors of dissatisfaction. Not because reality is bad, but because the imagined version was never realistic to begin with. The problem is where those expectations came from. They didn't appear from thin air. They were assembled from 1,000 sources. Stories we were told, images we absorbed, comparisons we made, goals we inherited from cultures and families and media that didn't know anything specific about us. Martin Seligman, the founder of positive psychology and former president of the American Psychological Association, has written extensively about the epidemic of what he calls learned helplessness, a state in which people, after repeated experiences of not being able to control outcomes, begin to believe on a deep level that effort is pointless. That the gap between trying and succeeding is so unpredictable that the trying itself becomes painful. And here's the brutal intersection with mortality. If you believe that effort doesn't reliably produce results, and you also know that life ends regardless of how much you tried, the logical conclusion the brain reaches is sometimes this: then why bother at all? This is not a rare thought. Research suggests it's an extremely common one. A 2019 survey by the American Psychological Association found that a majority of Americans reported feeling a persistent sense that their efforts weren't making a meaningful difference in their lives, even among people who, by external measures, were doing well. But here's what Seligman and his colleagues discovered next, and this is where things get interesting. Learned helplessness is not permanent. It is not hardwired. It is a learned pattern, which means it can be unlearned, and the thing that unlearns it is not willpower, it's not positive thinking, it's not motivation, it's small, verifiable experiences of agency. When you take a genuinely small action, small enough to succeed, and you experience the actual result of that action, something in the brain's threat detection system recalibrates. It registers, oh, what I do here has effects there. And the connection between effort and outcome begins to rebuild itself. This sounds almost too simple, and that simplicity is exactly why most people dismiss it and keep looking for a bigger answer. But we'll come back to this, because it connects directly to what psychology says is the most effective response to existential despair. You might be wondering at this point, is any of this hardwired? Is the need for meaning actually built into the brain? The answer increasingly appears to be yes. Neuroscientist Andrew Newberg has spent decades studying what happens in the brain during experiences people describe as deeply meaningful. Meditation, prayer, moments of profound connection, experiences of awe. And what he's consistently found is that these states activate a network of brain regions associated with reward, emotional processing, and autobiographical memory in ways that are measurably different from ordinary positive experiences like pleasure or comfort. Meaning, in other words, is not just a feeling. It has a neurological signature, and the brain appears to treat it as a survival resource, something it actively seeks, prioritizes, and is measurably distressed by the absence of. Research published in 2019 in Nature Human Behavior found that when people were given brain scans while contemplating things they found deeply meaningful versus things they found merely pleasant, the meaningful experiences showed stronger and more widespread activation across the prefrontal cortex, the default mode network, and subcortical structures associated with motivation and memory consolidation. What does that mean in plain language? It means that meaning doesn't just feel good, it organizes the brain. It creates coherent patterns of neural activity that connect past experience to present behavior to future planning. Meaning is how the brain makes sense of itself, and when that coherence is absent, when there is nothing connecting your past to your present to any imagined future, the brain experiences this as a kind of emergency. Not always loudly, sometimes it's a slow, growing sense of wrongness. An off-key note that you can't stop hearing underneath everything else. Psychiatrist and researcher Roy Baumeister, who has studied meaning extensively, describes 4 components that the human mind needs in order to feel that life is meaningful: purpose, goals and direction, values, a sense of right and wrong to guide decisions, efficacy, a belief that you can make a difference, and self-worth, a sense that you are fundamentally a person who matters. Notice what's on that list and what isn't. Happiness isn't there, comfort isn't there, success as conventionally measured isn't there. What's there is structure. Psychological structure. A way of relating to your own existence that gives it a shape and direction, regardless of external circumstances. And this is perhaps the most important insight in this entire video. Meaning is not something that happens to you. It is something you construct. And unlike happiness, which rises and falls with circumstances, meaning is something that can remain stable, even during suffering, even during loss, even in the face of mortality. But, and this is the part no one tells you, construction takes work. It requires the very thing your brain, in its anxiety, most wants to avoid. It requires confronting the real questions directly. Psychologists who study what happens when people genuinely reckon with their own death, not in an abstract life is short way, but in a real, visceral, unavoidable way, have identified roughly 3 distinct response patterns. Understanding which one you default to is one of the most psychologically illuminating things you can do. The first response is denial. This is the most common one. It looks like staying busy, staying distracted, keeping the schedule full so the quiet never gets loud enough to ask real questions. It looks like changing the subject when conversations get too deep, or laughing off anything that feels like it's heading toward existential territory. Denial isn't stupidity, it's a defense mechanism, and it has a legitimate function. Becker argued that a complete absence of denial would be psychologically crippling, that human civilization requires some capacity to bracket the terror of death in order to function. He was probably right. The problem is when denial stops being a tool you use strategically and becomes the default setting you can't turn off. When it's no longer a choice, but a compulsion. When entire areas of your inner life become off limits because they might lead somewhere uncomfortable. The research consistently shows that chronic rigid denial is associated with lower psychological flexibility, greater vulnerability to anxiety disorders, and a tendency toward what psychologists call experiential avoidance. A broad pattern of pushing away difficult internal states that, paradoxically, makes those states more powerful, not less. The second response is despair. This is less common than denial, but more visible when it appears. Despair is what happens when the awareness of mortality arrives without any supporting structure of meaning. When someone looks at the fact that life ends and concludes, therefore nothing matters. Despair is the psychological position of looking at the finitude of life and finding it annihilating. Word chosen deliberately. Finding it a reason to stop investing, stop caring, stop trying. The philosopher Albert Camus spent much of his career arguing with this conclusion. His famous opening line in The Myth of Sisyphus, "There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide," was not a depressive statement. It was an existential one. His point was, if life has no inherent meaning, and if we can see that clearly, then the question of whether to continue living becomes a philosophical decision, not just a biological given. And his answer, after a great deal of philosophical work, was what he called revolt, the decision to embrace life fully, to create meaning defiantly, precisely because nothing guarantees it from the outside. To be like Sisyphus, rolling the boulder up the hill, knowing it will roll back down, and choosing to consider him happy in that struggle, because the struggle itself, chosen freely, is the meaning. This is psychologically important because despair, like denial, is not a fixed state, it's a response. And like all responses, it can be changed not by arguing with reality, but by changing your relationship to reality. The third response is what psychologists call post-traumatic growth, or in the context of mortality specifically, what some researchers call mortality integration. This is the rarest response, but also the most fascinating one, and the one that the research says leads to the highest levels of well-being, meaning, and what psychologist Carol Riff calls psychological flourishing. Mortality integration doesn't mean that you're comfortable with death. It doesn't mean you've made peace with loss in some tidy bumper sticker way. It means you've done the psychological work of actually absorbing the fact of your finitude, and instead of running from it or collapsing into it, you've used it. Used it as a lens. A clarifying lens that makes the important things more visible and the unimportant things less consuming. We'll talk in depth about what that process looks like and what the research says it produces. But before we do, there's a question we need to ask that most conversations about mortality never get to. Here's a question that sounds philosophical but is actually deeply psychological. Why do human beings invest so intensely in things that they know, rationally, clearly, are temporary? You know that the relationship might not last forever. You know the career can end. You know the body will age. You know the achievement, once reached, will be replaced by the next achievement. You know that the approval of other people is not permanent, not guaranteed, and not actually within your control. And yet, you pour yourself into these things, you lose sleep over them, you feel their weight in your chest on the days when they're uncertain. Why? The answer is more interesting than it might seem. Evolutionary psychologists argue that this is not a design flaw, it's a feature. The human brain is wired for deep investment in temporary things because investment is what produces survival and reproduction. The brain doesn't calculate immortality, it calculates commitment, because commitment produces results on the time scale that matters evolutionarily, the next generation. But here's where evolution stops being useful to you personally. Evolution shaped a brain that invests intensely in the near term, is highly sensitive to loss and social rejection, is deeply motivated by status and belonging, and has almost no innate mechanism for zooming out to the 100-year view and asking, is this what I actually want? That 100-year view, that bird's eye perspective, requires deliberate effort. It requires what psychologist Daniel Kahneman calls System 2 thinking, slow, deliberate, effortful cognition that can override the fast, automatic, emotionally driven responses of System 1. And the problem with mortality specifically is that it lives in System 1. It triggers fast, deep, visceral responses that bypass rational analysis entirely. So thinking about mortality clearly, in a way that actually informs your choices, requires a kind of psychological counterforce that doesn't come naturally. It has to be cultivated, deliberately. Which is exactly why various philosophical and spiritual traditions, across history and across cultures, have developed specific practices for this. The Stoics called it memento mori. Remember that you will die. Medieval Christians created elaborate art and ritual around the transience of life. Buddhist meditation traditions include specific contemplations on death and impermanence. Ancient Egyptians brought symbols of death to feasts. These weren't morbid obsessions, they were tools, psychological technologies for generating the clarity that mortality awareness, properly processed, can produce. And modern psychology is now discovering why they work. In 2007, researchers Laura King and Joshua Hicks published a paper that challenged a key assumption of terror management theory. They asked, is mortality salience always defensive? Does awareness of death always push people toward clinging more rigidly to their existing worldviews? Their answer was no. It depends on one critical variable, meaning. When people who already had a strong sense of meaning in their lives were reminded of mortality, they did not become more rigid or defensive. They became more open, more curious, more willing to engage with perspectives different from their own, more generous, more present. The reminder of death, instead of activating their defenses, activated their values. Because for someone who already has a working answer to what matters, the reminder of death doesn't create a void. It creates an urgency to act on what already matters. This finding has been replicated and expanded. Psychologists Tomer and Eliasson developed what they call the comprehensive model of death anxiety, which distinguishes between different types of death-related fear and shows that the most corrosive form is not fear of death itself. It's what they call sense of incompleteness, the feeling that you haven't done what you came here to do and that you might run out of time before you do. In other words, the deepest fear is not dying, it's dying having not really lived. And here's where that becomes actionable. If the fear underneath the existential anxiety is incompleteness, in the sense that the life you're living doesn't match the life you feel you're capable of, then the answer is not to suppress the anxiety. The answer is to use it as a compass, not every day, not in a paralyzing way, but in the same way you might use a map, occasionally, deliberately, to check whether the direction you're moving actually leads where you want to go. Psychologist Irvin Yalom, one of the most respected existential therapists in the world, and author of Staring at the Sun, Overcoming the Terror of Death, describes what he calls awakening experiences, moments that crack open the ordinary surface of life and force a confrontation with what's real. Near-death experiences are the most dramatic form, but Yalom documents many others: serious illness in oneself or someone close, the death of a contemporary, a significant birthday, a divorce, a job loss, a period of deep isolation. What these moments share is that they strip away the protective layer of routine and habit and distraction that normally keeps existential awareness at bay. And what they reveal, beneath that layer, if the person is willing to look, is often a truer picture of what they actually value, what they've been avoiding, and what they still want to do. Yalom calls the therapeutic potential of these moments the gift of death anxiety. Not that death is good, but that the anxiety it produces, properly worked through, is one of the most powerful catalysts for genuine psychological change available to human beings. Let's get specific about something that's easy to talk about abstractly but becomes very concrete when you look at the data. What do people actually regret? Bronnie Ware is an Australian nurse who spent years caring for people in the final weeks of their lives. She compiled their reflections into a book called The Top 5 Regrets of the Dying, which became internationally known, and which, despite not being a formal scientific study, is so consistent with the academic literature on regret that researchers have repeatedly cited it. The 5 regrets she documented. 1. I wish I'd had the courage to live a life true to myself, not the life others expected of me. This was the most common regret. People looking back at their lives with full clarity were not upset about their failures. They were heartbroken about the paths they didn't take, the dreams they had quietly set aside in deference to external expectations, social pressure, or the anxiety of being different. 2. I wish I hadn't worked so hard. Almost universal among male patients, Ware noted, a lifetime of prioritizing productivity and achievement, and at the end, the ache of all the moments that productivity crowded out. 3. I wish I'd had the courage to express my feelings. Conversations not had, love not expressed, anger not addressed, things unsaid that accumulated into years of low-grade disconnection from the people who mattered most. 4. I wish I had stayed in touch with my friends. The slow erosion of friendships under the pressure of busyness, duty, distance, and the profound loneliness of realizing near the end how much those connections would have mattered. 5. I wish I had let myself be happier. The recognition that happiness, real, present, embodied joy, was always available. That it didn't require the conditions they were waiting for. That the waiting itself was the mistake. Now, academic research on regret confirms and deepens these patterns. Psychologist Thomas Gilovich at Cornell has studied regret for decades and found a consistent pattern across cultures and age groups. In the short term, people tend to regret actions, things they did that turned out badly. But over time, those action regrets fade. What doesn't fade, and in fact tends to intensify over time, is regret for inaction. The things people didn't do, the risks they didn't take, the changes they delayed. Why? Because actions that turned out badly at least provide information, closure, and the ability to adapt. Inactions remain permanently open, forever tinged with the what-if that never gets answered. And the category of regret that Gilovich's research identifies as most painful in old age is not career-related or financial. It's related to not being the person one wanted to be, falling short of what his research calls the ideal self, rather than the ought self. The ought self is who others think you should be. The ideal self is who you believe, in your deepest moments of self-knowledge, you actually could become. The gap between those two, and the years spent chasing the ought, while the ideal waited, is one of the heaviest psychological weights the research has documented. Here's a counterintuitive finding that consistently surprises people when they first hear it. Research shows that knowing something will end makes it more, not less, meaningful in the present. This sounds paradoxical. We tend to think that permanence is what gives something value. We preserve, archive, memorialize, frame, and bottle things precisely because we believe that their worth increases with their longevity. But the psychological research suggests the opposite. In a 2014 study by Christian Layus and Sonia Lubomirsky at the University of California, Riverside, Participants were asked to spend 1 month noticing and appreciating positive experiences in their daily lives. Some participants were additionally told to reflect on the fact that each experience was temporary, that it would soon be gone. Those participants showed significantly greater appreciation for their experiences and significantly higher levels of well-being than the control group. Other research has shown that people report more intense enjoyment of music when they're told the piece is about to end. They savor food more when they're aware they won't be able to eat it again. They pay more attention in conversations when they know they're the last ones they'll have with a particular person. The psychological mechanism here is what researchers call savoring, the deliberate, present-focused appreciation of an experience. And it is consistently associated with higher well-being, stronger emotional memory, and greater life satisfaction. And the thing that most reliably activates savoring? Awareness of impermanence. This is the insight that Buddhist philosophy has been expressing for 500 years. That attachment to permanence is the source of suffering, and that the full appreciation of something requires accepting, and even embracing, its impermanence. The cherry blossom is beautiful, not despite the fact that it falls in days, but because of it. Western psychology, for most of its history, treated this as a spiritual idea. Interesting but not empirically testable. Now the data is in, and it turns out the contemplative traditions were onto something real. The research on what's called hedonic adaptation, the human tendency to return to a baseline level of happiness regardless of what happens, shows that the enemy of gratitude is familiarity. That things we encounter repeatedly and reliably lose their emotional charge because the brain stops registering them as significant. Impermanence awareness interrupts hedonic adaptation. It recharges the emotional significance of the familiar by reminding the brain this won't always be here, which means one of the most psychologically useful things you can do today, this week, with no resources required, is to look at something in your life that you've stopped really seeing and remind yourself, this is temporary. This will end. What is it worth to me right now before it does? Let's go somewhere unexpected for a moment. The relationship between awareness of death and creative output. There is a body of research, not as widely known as it should be, suggesting that mortality awareness is one of the most powerful drivers of creative and intellectual output in human history. Terror management theory. Researchers have found in experimental conditions that when people are reminded of their mortality, they show significantly increased motivation to create things that outlast them. Paintings, writing, architecture, music, legacy building of all kinds, the desire to leave a mark. But that's just the lab version of something that history has shown repeatedly at scale. Psychologist Dean Keith Simonton, who has spent decades studying creativity and genius, has documented what he calls the swan song phenomenon, the tendency of creative people near the end of their lives, when they know their time is limited, to produce work of extraordinary depth and quality. The late works of Beethoven, Rembrandt, Michelangelo, Shakespeare all show a distinctive shift towards something more essential, more stripped down, more direct, less concerned with impressing, more concerned with expressing. The psychological interpretation is straightforward. When death becomes real rather than theoretical, the brain deprioritizes the goals that are about approval and prioritizes the goals that are about significance. The question shifts from, what will people think? What do I actually need to say? And this shift in creative motivation is not limited to artists. The same research shows it in ordinary people. When people are helped to genuinely reckon with their mortality, not in a traumatizing way, but in a supported, reflective way, they consistently report greater clarity about what they want to do with their remaining time. Greater willingness to take risks, greater tolerance for being misunderstood, less concern with petty social games, and more investment in genuine relationships. In other words, the awareness of death, when it doesn't trigger defense, triggers authenticity. And authenticity in the psychological literature is one of the most robust predictors of well-being, life satisfaction, and what researchers call psychological vitality. A felt sense of being alive in a full, engaged, genuine way. We're about 70% of the way through this conversation, and I've been building to something. Everything we've talked about. Terror management theory, meaning near-death experiences, regret, impermanence, creativity. It all circles around one central question. A question that most people have felt but not quite articulated. A question that, once you ask it with real honesty, has the power to reorganize how you see almost everything. Here it is. If you knew, with certainty, that you had 5 more years to live, would you be living the way you're living right now? Not in the dramatic sense, not, would you quit your job and travel? Maybe, maybe not. But in the deeper sense, would you be spending your attention the way you're spending it? Would you be having the conversations you're having or not having? Would you be carrying the grudges you're carrying? Would you be waiting for the conditions to be better before you let yourself feel what you actually feel? Irvin Yalom uses this exercise with modifications in therapeutic settings. He notes that almost no one who genuinely engages with it comes away unchanged, and the changes are almost never what people expect. They're not dramatic resolutions, they're quiet clarifications. A conversation that needs to happen, a creative project that keeps being postponed, a relationship that's been allowed to cool through neglect, a way of showing up in your own life that feels truer than the one you've settled into. The psychologically interesting thing is that 5 years is actually a long time. Long enough to do almost anything you actually want to do. Long enough to repair what needs repairing. Long enough to build what you want to build. Long enough to say what needs to be said. The point is not the 5 years, the point is what happens to your priorities when the open-endedness of your remaining time becomes in imagination closed. Martin Heidegger, the philosopher whose concept of being toward death influenced almost all subsequent existential psychology, argued that humans live in what he called inauthenticity most of the time. Not because we're bad or shallow, but because the social world we inhabit constantly provides ready-made roles, expectations, and interpretations that let us avoid the genuinely personal question of what we, individually, uniquely, are here for. Death, Heidegger argued, is the one event that cannot be delegated or replaced or shared. No one can die your death for you, and the full absorption of that fact, what he called running ahead into death, is what makes genuine self-authorship possible. Because once you accept that your time is finite and yours alone, you become for the first time genuinely responsible for how you use it. This is not a pessimistic argument, it's a liberating one, because it means that the very thing that feels like it should make life meaningless, the fact that it ends, is actually the condition of possibility for meaning. A life that lasted forever would have no urgency, no stakes, no need to choose. You could always do it later. But a life that ends, every choice matters. Every day counts. Every relationship has weight precisely because its time is limited. The Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh put it this way: the most precious gift we can offer anyone is our attention. When mindfulness embraces those we love, they will bloom like flowers. And underlying that statement is the recognition that attention is finite, which is exactly what makes it precious. You cannot give your attention to everything. The fact that you have given it to this conversation, to this question, to this moment, is itself a choice. And it reflects, whether you've articulated it or not, something about what you value. The invitation this video is making is not a dramatic one. It's not, throw everything away and start over. It's not, you're doing it all wrong. It's this, look at what you're doing with your finite, irreplaceable, genuinely one-of-a-kind life, and do it with your eyes open. Because the alternative, living by default, by habit, by other people's expectations, by the fear of what might happen if you actually chose, is not safety. It's the thing that produces, at the end, the deepest regret. We've spent a lot of time in the deep end. Let's bring this back to the surface, to the practical, the specific, the actionable. Because here's what I don't want to do. I don't want to spend an entire conversation on the weight of mortality and then leave you with nothing to do with it. That would be exactly the opposite of what this research suggests is helpful. So let's talk about what the psychology actually says works. Not in a 10 easy steps way, but in a real, evidence-based, honest way. First, deliberate mortality reflection. Done gently and regularly. Not morbid obsession, not rumination, but intentional, structured engagement with the question of your own finitude. Researchers studying mortality salience as a therapeutic tool have found that brief, regular, supported reflection on death, in journaling, meditation, or structured conversation, can produce the same positive psychological effects as the spontaneous awakening experiences Yalom describes, but without the trauma. Studies on what's called the death meditation practice, found in various contemplative traditions and now being studied in Western psychological contexts, consistently show reductions in death anxiety, increases in present moment engagement, and greater clarity about personal values among participants who practice it regularly. The key word is gently. This is not about forcing yourself to stare at horror. It's about giving yourself permission to look for a few minutes at a time at the fact of your finitude or pasuri and noticing what comes up, what feels unfinished, what feels right, what the looking clarifies. Second, values clarification, the act of naming what actually matters. Research by Stephen Hayes, the developer of Acceptance and Commitment Therapy, ACT, one of the most empirically supported therapeutic approaches in modern psychology, consistently finds that clarifying your values, not goals, but underlying values, is one of the most effective interventions for psychological well-being. The distinction between goals and values is important. A goal is a destination. Get the job, finish the degree, reach the milestone. A value is a direction. Be honest, grow, connect deeply, contribute. Goals can be achieved and completed. Values are ongoing commitments. You can never be done with being honest or growing. Hayes' research shows that people who are living in alignment with their stated values, who are making choices that move in the direction of what they say matters to them, show measurably higher psychological flexibility, lower anxiety, higher life satisfaction, and greater resilience in the face of difficulty. And the first step to living in alignment with your values is knowing what they are, which sounds obvious until you actually try to do it, and realize how rarely most of us stop to articulate, specifically and honestly, what we're actually living for. Third, post-traumatic growth practices. Building narrative coherence. Psychologists Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun, who developed the concept of post-traumatic growth, found that what distinguishes people who grow through difficult experiences from those who merely survive them is the ability to construct a narrative around what happened, a story that integrates the painful experience into a broader account of who they are and what their life means. This doesn't mean spinning difficulty into fake positivity. It means finding, honestly, what the experience taught, how it changed things, and what possibilities it opened, even if it also closed others. Journaling practices, therapeutic conversation, and even certain kinds of community-based storytelling all support this narrative construction. And the research is clear. People who can tell a coherent story about their struggles, including the struggles with mortality and meaninglessness, show consistently better long-term outcomes than those who can't. Fourth, social connection requires, and specifically depth over breadth. This one isn't surprising, but the magnitude of the effect still manages to surprise people. The Harvard study of adult development, the longest-running study of human adult life ever conducted, following participants for over 80 years, found that the single most powerful predictor of health, happiness, and longevity in old age was not wealth, not fame, not achievement, not even good habits. It was the quality of close relationships. Robert Waldinger, the current director of the study, has summarized the finding in a widely viewed TED Talk. Good relationships keep us happier and healthier. Period. And what makes relationships good in the data? Not how many of them you have, not how conflict-free they are. What matters most is the felt sense of being able to rely on the people in them, of being known and seen and genuinely cared for by at least some of the people in your life, which connects directly to the mortality conversation. Because one of the things that makes confronting your own finitude most bearable is doing it with people who genuinely know you, who can hold the weight of the real questions alongside you, whose presence makes the uncertainty feel, if not comfortable, then at least shared. Let's do something slightly different here. Let's take all of the theory, all the research, all the philosophical frameworks, all the data, and reduce it to what it actually looks like in practice, in real life, on a Tuesday. Because the risk with conversations like this is that they feel profound in the moment and then fade. The insight doesn't become anything. You close the tab, or put down the book, or finish the video, and an hour later you're back in the ordinary stream of habit and obligation, and the questions have gone quiet again. So what does it actually look like to integrate this into how you live? It looks like this. It looks like pausing. Once in a while, not every day, not with great drama, and asking, if this were the last week I had this, would I experience it differently? Not necessarily the last week of your life. The last week with this person in the same city, the last week with this capability, the last time this season comes around. It looks like having the conversation you've been putting off. Not because it's easy, not because you're guaranteed to get it right, but because the reason you've been putting it off is probably not as good as the reason to have it. It looks like choosing, deliberately, what you give your attention to a papadakiliu, and doing that more often than you choose by default, by habit, by the path of least resistance. It looks like noticing the ordinary beautiful things, not in a saccharine way, just noticing. The light through a window, the sound of someone laughing, the fact that your body's doing something extraordinary right now, without your instruction, breathing, circulating, sensing, and it has been doing this every single moment since you arrived and will not always. It looks like making something, anything, not because it will last or because anyone will care, but because the making itself, the act of putting your specific attention and intention into the shape of something, is one of the most direct routes to the felt sense of meaning that the brain is hungry for. And it looks like forgiving faster. Carrying grudges is an investment of limited attention in the past, in something that has already happened and cannot be changed. And it is a loan you make with time you will not get back. None of these things are dramatic. None of them require a complete life overhaul or a spiritual transformation or a near-death experience. They are small, available, sustainable choices, and the research suggests that small, consistent choices in the direction of your values produce over time the kind of life that feels, at the end, like it was genuinely yours. We need to go somewhere difficult before we close, because this video is about struggle and mortality, and some of the people watching this are not just philosophically curious. Some of you are in real pain. Some of you have looked at the question, all this struggle just for life to end on a random day, and felt not curiosity but exhaustion, not philosophical interest but genuine despair, and I don't want to rush past that. If you are someone for whom the weight of this question is not abstract, if you are at a point where the finitude of life feels not like something to make peace with, but like an invitation to stop fighting, I want to speak to you directly for a moment. What you are feeling is not proof that life has no value. It is proof that you are in pain that exceeds right now your current resources for bearing it. That is not a permanent state, even though it feels permanent. Pain of that magnitude distorts time. It makes the present feel endless, and the future feel unreachable, neither of which is actually true. The research on suicidal crises is extremely clear on one point. Most people who survive a serious attempt and later recover report that they did not want their life to end. They wanted the pain they were experiencing to end. The desire was not death, it was relief. It was rest, it was for the weight to become bearable. And that distinction matters enormously, because there are ways to reduce the weight that are not irreversible. There are resources, people, treatments, and time, all of which can change the equation. If you're in that place right now, please reach out to someone, a person you trust, a mental health professional, or a crisis line in your region. You do not have to have this conversation alone. You do not have to figure out the meaning of life while you are in the middle of experiencing its full weight. The question of how to live well in the face of mortality is one that deserves to be asked from a place of relative stability, and getting to that place, if you're not there, is the first most important thing. Everything else can wait. Here's what all of this has been building toward. Every person who has ever lived has faced exactly the same situation you are in. They arrived without choosing to. They struggled to understand why they were here and what they were supposed to do. They loved things that were temporary. They lost things that mattered. They tried and sometimes failed. They carried confusion and uncertainty alongside moments of genuine grace. And one day, each of them, every single one, without exception, stopped. That is the full story. That is the shape of what it is to be a human being. And here is what the research, the philosophy, the clinical observation, the lived testimony of people at the end of their lives all converge on. The answer to all this struggle just for life to end on a random day is not nihilism, it's not despair, it's not rage, and it's not false comfort. The answer is this: the struggle is not separate from the meaning. It is the meaning. Not in a punishing, suffering is good for you way, but in the very specific sense that a life without challenge, without effort, without the experience of caring so much about something that you risk disappointment, is a life without genuine engagement. It is a life spent watching from a distance. Effort is evidence of caring. And caring is the only reliable source of the meaning the brain actually needs. The people who arrive at the end of their lives most at peace are not, the research consistently shows, the ones who had the smoothest journey. They are the ones who can look back and say, I tried, I cared, I showed up, I was present for at least some of the moments that mattered. I was genuinely here. That's it. That's the whole thing. Not achievement, not certainty. Not having it figured out. Just being genuinely, fully, sometimes messily, sometimes beautifully here. Irvin Yalom, who has sat with more dying people than almost any therapist alive, writes that the patients who approach death with the most equanimity are those who feel they have fully inhabited their lives. Not that they did everything right, not that they had no regrets, but that they were present for their own existence, yet that they did not sleepwalk through it in distraction and avoidance and waiting for conditions to be better. And the extraordinary hopeful thing about that finding is this: you can start inhabiting your life at any point, including right now, including today. The finitude is not the enemy. The sleepwalking is the enemy. Wake up, look around, feel the weight and the wonder of being here. At this particular moment in history, in this particular body, with these particular people within reach, and none of it guaranteed to last. And let that not destroy you, but call you forward. If this video touched something real in you, if it raised a question you needed to sit with, or named something you'd been feeling but hadn't quite found words for, I want to hear about that. Leave it in the comments. Not because it will go viral, but because naming the real things, putting them into words, is itself a psychologically meaningful act. It is part of how you construct the meaning we've been talking about. If someone you know is navigating these questions, the weight of effort, the fear of meaninglessness, the quiet vertigo of being alive and knowing it, consider sharing this with them, not as a solution, just as company. Because one of the things the research is clearest on is that these questions are easier to carry when you're not carrying them alone. And if you want to go deeper into any of the ideas we explored today, terror management theory, logotherapy, post-traumatic growth, existential psychology, I'll leave a list of the books and researchers mentioned in the description, not as homework, just as doors, if you want to walk through them. Take care of yourself. That's not a throwaway line. It means pay attention to what you actually need, and then give it to yourself with the same compassion you'd offer to someone you love. The life that ends on a random day is also the life that's happening right now. Be in it.